Welcome everyone to the roundtable discussion, COVID under the microscope. I'm going to say a few words in German and then the rest of the event will continue in English. Liebe Zuschauer, willkommen in dieser Gesprächsrunde unter der Ägide von der Central European University. Die Universität freut sich besonders, zum ersten Mal an der Langen Nacht der Forschung teilnehmen zu können, als neues Mitglied der akademischen Gemeinschaft Wiens und Österreichs. Mein Name ist Andrew Solomon. Ich war bis vor kurzem der Sendungsverantwortliche von Universum beim ORF. Wir haben ein internationales Panel von Experten, die die Herausforderungen, die Risiken und Gefahren, aber vor allem die Chancen für die Menschheit besprechen wollen, die durch die Covid-Pandemie entstehen. Wir werden diese Diskussion, wie gesagt, auf Englisch führen. Welcome to this Central University Borderless Knowledge Roundtable discussion entitled COVID Under the Microscope. The Central European University is delighted to join this year's Lange Nacht Der Forschung for the first time, marking the university's becoming part of Austria's and Vienna's academic community. Endless hours have been devoted to the COVID-19 pandemic in both the mainstream media and in social media. Much of that coverage has been about the immediate causes and consequences of the pandemic. Today's panelists have specialized in global and regional environmental and economic studies over the longer term. And in 2020, they have been able to observe this unprecedented pandemic through the lens of their disciplines. So for the next hour, we're going to be looking forward to sharing their insights. What are the longer-term consequences and risks, but also opportunities that the pandemic brings with it? How has this crisis affected their work? And how should we all be getting our information about these risks and opportunities? So let me introduce our environmental and our economic experts. Diana Oeger-Forschatz.
Hello.
Dana, can you say hi?
Hi. Hi.
Diana is professor at the Environmental Sciences and Policy Department here at the CEU and a coordinating lead author on the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. Luis Gomez Echeverri.
Hello, here I am. Hello.
Is Emeritus Research Scholar at the IIASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis at Lange near Vienna. After many years at the United Nations, Luis came to the IIASA to be Associate Director of the Global Energy Assessment. And currently, he is co-leading the consultative science platform on COVID-19 together with the International Science Council and other partners. Dora Piroshka. Dora, can you say hi?
Yes, hello everyone and welcome to our discussion.
Dora Piroshka of Corvinus University in Budapest is a visiting professor at the International Relations Department of the Central European University, specializing in banking-related issues and in the political economy, especially in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And Matthias Thiemann.
Hello, everybody.
Matthias,
Hello, everybody. Nice to be here.
Matthias is Associate Professor of European Public Policy at Sciences Po in Paris, with close affinities to the political economy. He has studied the regulation of risk-taking in the financial industry and analyzed why some regulatory tools are taken up by policymakers and others not. And I'm Andrew Solomon, until recently head of the long-running wildlife documentary series Universum at ORF, and so especially interested in our relationship with the natural world. I'd like to start by asking Diana Oeger-Forschatz from the Environmental Sciences and Policy Department of the CEU. Diana, is there a principal lesson to be taken from this crisis?
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. Yes, let me argue that, in fact, there are two principal lessons from my perspective and from the sciences that I'm working in. There are two important lessons from the COVID crisis. And one is that definitely there is sufficient evidence that pandemics and epidemics in general are increasing in frequency, increasing in severity in terms of their spreading out over the world. And we can largely thank it to ourselves, to our relationship to nature. So in fact, this might be one of our last warnings that shows that if we continue our exploitative relationship with nature, then we may, civilization's long-term survival is at risk, because we seem to have survived this pandemic fairly well, but if another virus comes or another pathogen comes with a much higher mortality ratio, but other favorable conditions, then either a pandemic or, as I will show you, there are many other risks that we are causing as a result of our relationship with nature are seriously jeopardizing the long-term survival, not survival, but our long-term foundations of our civilization in terms of culture and food supply and so on. At the same time, my other big message is that we also created, that COVID-19 crisis also created us a new opportunity for rebalancing this relationship with nature and perhaps potentially fast forwarding many of those transitions that we have to do anyway, for example, in order to fight climate change. And for that, we have great news that the Parliament accepted a much more stringent emission reduction ratio recently. But let's just very quickly go through what's the connection? Why do we state that scientific evidence shows that there is increasing acceleration of epidemics in the Anthropocene? Approximately 4 or 5 new epidemics are starting every year now. Most of these, about 3/4 of these, are zoonoses, so are a result of our relationship with wild animals. And the reason why these are accelerating is they're manifold, but some of them are here. We are disturbing the balance of species. In fact, we are favoring a few species, and we are making others extinct. Currently, over 1 million species, over 6 million on the territorial parts of the planet are facing potential extinction. We are also causing very substantial habitat loss. Only 16% of the planet's ice-free surface is still fairly intact by human use. The other we have very substantially converted to our purposes and reduced it to basically a handful of species instead of the 6 million that we currently have over the territory, of the ice-free territory of the planet. All of this causes increasing frequency of meeting with wild animals and for the pathogens of wild animals jumping to humans, which is called zoonosis. And climate change accelerates most of these processes and adds to these through other phenomena and other processes. Adding to this population growth and globalization, the recipe for pandemics is ready. So unless we act, we probably won't be able to help these two, but we definitely not only can, but have to reduce the loss of biodiversity, and we have to address climate change. Otherwise, as I said, there scientific evidence shows there is very significant risk to humanity. And as this Economist magazine cover has indicated, that yes, the recession, the COVID crisis and its recession is causing major loss of lives and health, as well as economic loss, but it's all nothing compared to the losses in both the human health as well as economy that are coming as a result of climate change, and which are, a lot of this is already here, but they are going to significantly increase. Nevertheless, my other important message is that at the same time, we have a unique opportunity to not only flatten the climate curve, but also to accelerate the transitions that we need in order to meet ambitious climate change goals as well as biodiversity related goals. And I just want to highlight a couple because I don't have time, unfortunately, to get into this, but perhaps into the details, but perhaps during the discussion on the economy, we can come back to some of these. So first of all, the crisis is actually affecting the most carbon intensive, the most polluting industries suffered last year. For example, aviation, the cruise industry, which is the most pollution intensive form of leisure, automobile manufacturing, oil, gas, and coal. They have all suffered very significantly. At the same time, it's interesting that low carbon energy proved to be most resilient. Renewable energy so far seems to be a winner of this economic crisis so far. So there seems to be a market contra-selection already towards low carbon energy forms. And in general, the crisis fast-forwarded the very essence of what we need in terms of the economic transitions for towards a low carbon economy. So instead of energy intensive product manufacturing, instead of an economy that is primarily based on providing services and a digital economy. And this has been significantly fast forwarded. And we have a chance not to go back to the old normal, but to seize these opportunities and take advantage of any of these where the negative impacts can be mitigated. We know that some of this has severe negative implications as well. The major stimulus spending, of course, is a fantastic opportunity because many countries are spending up to 28% of their GDPs on economic recovery. And in contrast, only 2.5% of annual GDP annually would be enough to solve climate change. So it's only how we spend it, and not even, it doesn't even require taking away the funds that we currently earmark, but only on how we spend, because there's a lot of money anyway flowing into the energy sector, since that was among the most affected. But the question is simply how we are spending it. The favorable conditions that come in addition, that due to the crisis, interest rates are likely to stay low, which favors investment intensive forms, for example, of energy, so meaning renewable energy and energy efficiency. These are getting favored as opposed to more fuel-intensive energy forms. For example, a lot of oil companies starting to shed their less profitable assets. Also, the drop in energy prices is a unique opportunity for removing fossil fuel subsidies. We are talking about energy carbon taxing and how to put a price on carbon, and we are talking about 5, 10, 20, whatever euros per ton of carbon dioxide, and even that is proving to be difficult. But at the same time, globally, we are still subsidizing every single ton of carbon dioxide emissions by $133 in terms of fossil fuel subsidies. Now, finally, not only the big industry and politics can do a lot, but also our behavioral change. Yes, we talk a lot about behavioral change, but behavioral sciences show that in fact, we usually don't change significantly. We just can't, except if there is a major change in our lives anyway. So if we get married, or if we have a new job, or we move somewhere, or we have a child, and so on. Now, this whole pandemic definitely is exactly that. It's a global laboratory, social science laboratory experiment. It forces us all to change our lifestyles, more or less, to different extents, but it does. This is a unique opportunity to experiment, but also to seize this opportunity to incorporate more sustainable lifestyle changes into this. And yes, according to polls, most Europeans do not want to return to the old normal. There are many polls, and the evidence shows that the old normal wasn't working. So it's very important that we do want to go back to normal, but not the old normal. We have to seize the opportunity to establish the new normal, which is reflecting the opportunities of provided by this crisis, which are very, very likely to be historic and once in a century. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussions of some of these issues.
Diana, thank you very much for setting out the problem so clearly and also hinting at some of the solutions. I'd like to move on that note to Luis Gomez Echeverri, who is working precisely on laying out some of the solutions with the consultative science platform on COVID-19. I believe you're about to publish your first report at the end of this month called Transformations Within Reach. So can you tell us some more about the approach that you're taking to this huge subject, how you break it down, and who you are and who you're talking to?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrew. And thank you, Diana, for that very comprehensive. And as you say, Andrew, it really sets the whole framework for our discussion in the next hour. So thank you. I also want to thank CEU for the privilege and the opportunity to be part of this panel. The International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, has been collaborating quite a bit with the Central European University, particularly with Dr. Urge Fortsatz, who has been one of our main collaborators, including on the initiative that I will be talking about in a few minutes. So now let me talk very briefly on the initiative. It was about some 5 months ago, the International Science Council in Paris and IASA decided to begin a collaborative effort to bring together scientists, practitioners, policymakers, and those influencing policy to share the observations of what we saw as a rapidly changing global crisis that was unfolding, and to start collecting through observations some of the elements for what we will now begin in the design of pathway scenarios that will enable us to build better back after post-COVID-19, as Diana is saying. So what we tried to do during this past 5 months is trying to observe some of the positives. Diana already mentioned some of those positive ones, so I will not repeat them. And also looking at some of the negatives. So our job was trying to see what can we do in order to try to enhance the positive, mitigate the negative, and to use this as a historic opportunity for building better. We try to focus only on four themes. And there we focus on strengthening science systems for reasons that all of us have seen and obvious in great need, on governance for sustainability, and then on energy and food systems. We did something that would allow us to consult as many people as possible from all over the world. And we brought together in each one of these themes 3 online consultations, bringing experts, scientists, practitioners from every region of the world, some over 300. And the question that we put as a framework for our discussions is, we have 2 alternatives. As also Diana was saying, we either go back to business as usual with all the negative implications that we were also seeing through our consultations on equal impacts, inequality, increased poverty, potential conflicts, already some conflicts in many parts of the world, or trying to identify those priorities where we saw that if we focus on a few transformations in each one of these areas, we could actually make some very quick impact. And the reason that we try to focus on those priorities is that this is not a long-term research. This is an applied research, if you like, observation of the last 5 months, and trying to use that in order to begin the process of building pathways, scenarios, research, looking at the knowledge gaps, etc. And I think the guiding principles that we had for doing this was that we felt that, we realized, and that this is already in the presentation of Diana, that we really were facing multiple compounding risks, many of this unpredictable, at least in the impacts, and that we really needed to prepare more and build by building resilience. that we really needed to use much more of the systemic thinking. We saw a lot of fragmentation. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And that policy making needed to be much more transparent and evidence-based. We felt that it is not at the moment. And I'm sure we will hear more of that from the political economists a little bit later on. So some of the highlights very quickly in the area of governance. We identified one of the major ones was trying to reform the global institutions, treaties, UN agencies, specialized agencies, all competing for resources, sometimes coordinating. I came from the United Nations. I can tell you that it's a very imperfect system. In the area of at the national governance, we really needed to increase much the risk and resilience aspects of our local governance. It is not at the center and at the core of these governance systems. In the area of design systems, we felt that some of the results were that it really needed some major reform. As in the case of the governance systems, many of the systems of science were established in the 20th century. We really needed to look at the transdisciplinary research, that we really needed to improve the communications for the policy and the understanding of the communities, of the population at large, which we know that was a big weakness of the past 5 months, including on issues of trust, etc. In the area of energy, we focus on a few issues, particularly on the urban issues, the urban transformation. We saw great opportunities. We saw many cities already doing a lot of very interesting things in changing the urban space and the urban design models, but also in the case of the consumption, and Diana talked about the behavioral changes, that we really needed to look at the change of consumption patterns, one that focused more on the sufficiency and need rather than on want. And then the last one, and with this I will finish, in the area of food, we felt that, at least the experts felt that there was a need for a major change from going from this obsession for increasing productivity and efficiency to one more focus on resilience and equity. And then the last one, and I will finish with that, because it's a big topic that Diana mentioned, is making the human and planetary health concern at the center of our priorities in the future, so that we can address the conflict that we now have on nature and humans, and that created so many of the problems that we have today. I will end there, and perhaps at the discussion period we can go more in detail.
Thank you very much, Luis. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And to pick up on two particular things you said, the fragmentation that you mentioned of the global institutions that were set up, as you told me as well, after the Second World War, and how they weren't really designed to be cooperating and talking to each other. And particularly in the area that I've been working in wildlife, it's become clear that the people who in conservation and environmental work who know how and why the viruses are transmitted to humans don't always have the best communication to the health organizations. And I think that's probably a very good example of one of the things that you have been talking about. You also connected that with the importance of science communication, which I'm sure is a subject that we will pick up in a little while, and the resilience of all those relationships that can lead to better governance, which again, I'm sure will be a topic later in the discussion. And I'd like, therefore, to talk to Dora Piroshka now, because both Diana and Luis have been giving us some very positive proposals that go along with the problems. Some of them actually quite exciting, but how does that seem from where you are with your specialization on Central and Eastern Europe and your examination of how governments and institutions in this region have been responding to the COVID crisis? I imagine that that's a rather different perspective. And it would be very interesting to know from the economic and social point of view, how you would respond to what we've been hearing up till now.
Yes, thank you, Andrew, and thank you for inviting me here and allowing me to share some of the results of our research that we undertook during the early phases of the COVID crisis in Central and Eastern Europe. And indeed, looking at the regional level, so coming down from the global level, I think it's interesting to see and point out diversity in policymaking. So yes, the pandemic is affecting all of us and lockdowns were universal. However, governments in their responses varied greatly, even within such a small region as the Central and Eastern European region. And I think understanding variation to begin with is really important because it allows to see, there is scope of action. There are choices, there are various ways in which we can go about tackling the crisis. And so there is not just one way to go about, but there are multiple ways. And so going about this, how to tackle, how to mitigate the impact of the COVID crisis, we put together, understanding this, we put together a working paper that I'm trying to find you and show you here. I hope it's this one. I'm going to show it quickly. Yes, so sorry about so that it would be, I'm sorry. Yes, so this is the title page here, mitigating the COVID-19 effect, emergency economic policy making in Central Europe. And here you see all the other authors. We looked at Austria, Hungary, Slovenia, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic in the early month. And basically our findings were, on this level of variation, pointing out differences in institutional structures that conditions those variations. So one important thing in the institutional differences of these 5 Central European countries were, of course, the importance of tripartite institutions. So to what extent representatives of labor and capital were involved in policy making. And what we found, of course, is a scale. So in some countries, like in Austria and Slovenia, these social partners were a lot more involved, whereas in Czech Republic, to some extent, Slovakia, even less extent, and in Hungary, they were practically excluded. And it's important to what extent, mitigating the impact of the COVID pandemic involves social partners, because these partners' involvement define also, the targets. So what are we going for? And these targets can be very contradictory among each other. But not only that, I want to come back to what Diana said, is that, of course, we all want a new normal, and the changes are, should be aiming that directions. But the immediate need of mitigating the risk, the social risk and economic risk of the COVID pandemic is actually might be contradictory to our long-term goal of building out a more harmonious relation with nature, because we have to, we have to provide employment right now. We have to provide social benefits right now. And these provisions might actually, just prolong the existing structures through which the economy functions. So that's what we found, looking at the immediate responses, is that instead of, reacting very clearly to the long-term effect of these economic policy for their impact on the economy, they were very short-sighted and concentrated on the immediate. So we looked at, labor market measures, again in these 5 countries, and found that the Kurzarbeit was introduced immediately everywhere. But again, very large variations included, to the extent that in Austria, we found a rather generous, waiting for work scheme, providing social provisions for those who cannot work because of the lockdown. And on the other end of the spectrum, Viktor Orban and his government used this opportunity to further liberalize the market and provide less benefit for workers than they had before the pandemic, and less voices for trade unions than they had before. So in a way, this crisis is an opportunity, but how governments and social partners go about it, it really varies greatly. Another interesting finding of our research was, what are the financial instruments through which the pandemic is tackled? and the effect of the pandemic and in the impact of the lockdowns. And here, a very interesting new institution emerges in the hands of government, and those are the development bank, National Development Bank, that I've been studying before with Matthias, even before the pandemic. But to our surprise, in Central Europe, where national development banks were long dormant or really non-important tools in the hands of the government, they were revived with the crisis. And what's really interesting about national development banks in this region especially is that they are some of the few instruments of governments through which they can condition how economic activities are pursued. And this conditioning, of course, might go into the direction, of being socially inclusive, but they also might go into directions of being environmentally more conscious. So governments have a fantastic tool, through the loan conditions. What are the conditions upon which, corporations might continue their functioning? Is that this functioning can be conditioned very directly and very immediately. So we were actually very happy to see that in all 5 countries, these development banks were used. Of course, they could have been, just funded even more. And finally, what we also found in relation to our 5 countries in Central and Eastern Europe, that in the literature, except for Austria, are usually characterized for dependent market economies, meaning that multinational corporations' involvement in their economy is way more important than local corporations' contribution to GDP, is that governments were constrained in their efforts to provide, revenues. So there was really, compared to Western Europe and compared to core countries, especially these Central European countries were kind of constrained and could only do a limited, they could only contribute to the limited extent into their economies. And that was also, on the taxation side, the same. They couldn't give that much tax relief as in Western European countries. So we did find a core periphery difference. And here, of course, all the countries that we looked at are members of the European Union. And the EU introduced some measures to provide for a greater policy interventions. But unfortunately, these EU measures affected, again, Western and Eastern European countries unevenly, because as the EU removed state aid, limits how much a government can have its own economy. Of course, if you are a resourceful government in the West, your scope again to spend on your economy is much larger than your scope if you are a poorest European government. So
Can I just step in there for a second, Dora, because I think you brought up about 3 or 4 such important points about the social sensitivity of the different governments and about the risk that the immediate provisions being taken could prolong the existing structure. And you've talked about the positive side of the development banks in a strong way. And also the whole situation of the dependent market economies. And I wonder if I could quickly pass over to Matthias so that we can see how that fits into that broader European and maybe even global view of the situation, taking up actually all those thoughts. Matthias, could we see your view on this from the continental or intercontinental perspective?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I'll try. And Dora, I thank you very much for having me, and it's a really fascinating discussion. And I can just pick up where Dora left off. I think the diversity in responses is a very important point. Just to give you the example of France, our president has given a very important speech a few months ago in which he pointed out that coûte que coûte, so cost it whatever it shall cost, he will have to respond to the COVID crisis. And it was actually a confession of a neoliberal conviction that he's now willing to shed. So we do see political players repositioning themselves also with respect to, for example, the role of the market. What is the role of the market in helping us in this transition? In other words, the role of the state is getting much stronger, and it's, I think, also there where the possibilities reside for a more efficient transition towards a more sustainable economy. I think I would like to follow up on Dora's comment on the network of national development banks and the European Investment Bank that we have seen as crucial players in the response. And yes, we see the most activity in rich Western countries. So the German KfW is basically guaranteeing every small and medium-sized enterprise in Germany that wants to apply, which is much less the case in Central and Eastern Europe. But even also, I mean, in Austria, the Austria Wirtschaftsservice, the National Development Bank of Austria, is granting 15 billion euros in help for small and medium-sized enterprises. So it's also something that is the case in Austria. On the European level, we have seen what is called now the Next Generation EU fund. That is the willingness of all member states to take up 750 billion euros to finance the problems that are caused by the COVID crisis. And I think that's a huge game changer. But the way that Eric Jones has put it from Johns Hopkins University is now the question is how to manage that money, what to do with the money, and how to actually make it sustainable. That is, where should we get, for example, taxation from, tax income for the European Union to be able to service the money. So there are plenty of questions and openings that the COVID crisis has caused, and it's to human agency, I think, partially at least, to make the most out of it. Just to say a little bit about the network of national development banks and the EIB. The European Investment Bank, which is the largest bank in Europe with more than 600 billion euro on the balance sheet, they are positioning themselves today as the climate bank of the European Union, and they're pushing themselves as this agent of change. And I think it's up to us as scientists, but also as critical citizens, to actually investigate and ask, are they really doing what is needed, or are they just labeling it as climate action, but as a matter of fact, they're just doing business as usual? And I think what is needed there is really a critical audience, a public that is questioning and pushing them to do more, because it is about pushing them outside of their comfort zone. And I'm happy to see that there are some NGOs like Counterbalance or Bankwatch that do that, but I think there is more work that is needed on that. And then just to end on it, and I mean, I think that's where I would like to second what Dora said. Yes, there is the possibility for these two to go together, the immediate crisis response and the longer term changes that are needed. And at the same time, there are also immediate contradictions, possibly at least. And to give you the example that is very close to the heart of the French, of course, but it's also very European, if I may, Airbus. Airbus has been or is being saved by the French government, basically. And what are they asked to do? They're basically asked to invent the impossible, which is the zero emission. I'm exaggerating here, the impossible, but the zero emission airplane flight, such that we can all be happy. And that has a lot to do with the inertia of invested capital. There's so much capital invested that they cannot just simply let go or give up. But and to link to that, I just wanted to add one more level of complexity, which are the different levels of governance, and then end there. So what I wanted to say with Airbus is states will seek to protect their invested capital, and they cannot just let go of thousands and thousands of employees. At the same time, what we do need is we can hope for, in a sense, for an economic growth and development and dynamism that stems from this shift towards a more sustainable economy. Just to point out to you, for example, as you may know, bikes, the demand for bikes in European Union has like gone up so much that you can't get any bike if you go to a store these days, or they'll tell you take a month or two. So this is a very interesting development, which is also very much in line with changes in cities that push for bikes. But it is also very much in contradiction almost with the large action on the state level when states are actually thinking about saving the automobile industry. So they are like in Germany, in France, and so on. All the money that is spent there, I mean, you could actually, just as a provocation, you could buy each European citizen an electric bike with all the money that is spent there, just like that. Just put it in front of their house and say, by the way, here's the electric bike, use it from now on, and stop polluting. That's a solution, but that solution contradicts the interest of fixed capital. Because so there is this tendency of states to go with their champions, their national champions. And as citizens, we have to ask, well, is Volkswagen really going to save us? Are electric cars really going to save us, and so on? But that's just for discussion, if I may. So I don't want to take up more of your time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Matthias. That was great, and a great launch into the discussion. Particularly the way this discussion looks like it's turning into a discussion between the immediate crisis response and how that ties in with the longer term development towards the new normal, and the dynamism that you're all suggesting is possible in the future if we do it right. But the two don't necessarily seem to be quite linked yet, and that's, I think, the center of the discussion. And Diana, I would like to ask you, just to start the discussion, and at this point I hope you will all interrupt and whenever you want to. Are there risks to the different economies of the policies that and the approach that you have been pushing? And you mentioned to me, I know, that we should look, for instance, at the East Asian economies and to their response. So I'm interested in what the risks are, and also whether there will be resistance in Western governments and Western populations to some of the things that actually you have all been suggesting.
Right, thank you very much, Andrew. Yes, I've been, you asked me earlier what really shocked me about this pandemic, and what really shocked me was that, in fact, it was really the Western advanced democracies which have been able to tackle the whole pandemic the least. And well, perhaps not the least, but much worse than the East Asian countries. And that was to me a major surprise, and in fact a very huge level of disappointment, and especially how we are approaching this in the second phase, in the second wave, and how we are severely prioritizing the economy over lives, even though I do think this is a false dichotomy, since no healthy economy can strive with a population who is struggling with a pandemic and who is trying to protect themselves as much as possible from getting sick or from other effects of the pandemic. Another aspect, what you mentioned, and coming back to what our colleagues have been discussing, is exactly this. So the risk of the controversial actions that we are taking right now. And one was very nicely highlighted by Matthias, the automobile industry versus bicycles. So on one hand, yes, this is an enormous opportunity to redesign our cities, rethink our cities, and also in the report that Luis is leading, this is, as he mentioned also, this is one of the major parts of that report, how to rethink cities, to reassign space for more the citizens rather than the metal boxes that currently own, the automobiles that own presently most of our cities. And how to reallocate more space to the citizens so that they can not only do more active, do more pandemic resilient mobility, which is walking and for example, bicycle, but there are many other active modes of mobility, which is, yes, unfortunately, public transport is definitely loser right now. but also which is more sustainable and leads to the longer term. Because if the other acceleration that is taking place is with more home officing and more digitalized services and more digitalized alternatives to entertainment, to culture, to errands, to almost everything, we need less office space as well, less retail space, less commercial space in the cities themselves. So if we try to reallocate some of that again to the people, we will result in much more livable cities and much more healthier populations that are also more pandemic resilient. But for example, as Matthias pointed out, and Dora also, there is this controversy that each government, almost each government in Europe, is on one hand trying to jump on the bandwagon of the green recovery, or at least claiming to, and that's a good question how much it is, although my data show that that France is actually on the forefront right now in Europe. So at least in the energy front, they really allocated most of their energy related recovery funding to renewables and much less to the fossils, whereas more countries are at the same time trying to put their dead, almost dead bodies to on the ventilator. So meaning those fossil fuel related industries that are really in big problem, like I don't know, Airbus is probably more controversial, but automobile companies or oil fields or oil discovery and natural gas fields. So definitely, I think there are plenty of opportunities, and I think Dora mentioned that that the two are excluding themselves, the long-term interest and the short-term interest of reviving the economy. I don't tend to agree. Certainly there are many controversial options, but most of the studies that have been conducted and most of the peer-reviewed literature that has published on this actually identified a couple which are really win-win. Interestingly, most of the studies identified, for example, building retrofits as one of the most, or not the most important, most employment-intensive ways of spending. And not only do they create the most jobs if we spend our money on deep retrofitting buildings, and they have to do the most local jobs, but they also help the population, especially those, the poor, the small moms and pops companies who lost income by avoiding energy expenditures. And we happen to have a lot of research actually at CEU that has helped for example, international agency to arrive to these conclusions, but also Sir Nicholas Stern, former economist of the World Bank, he published from London School of Economics. He has also published an important paper on this. So I'm not sure if there are necessary contradictions. I think we can do it in a way, we could do it in a way that there are no contradictions, but as you all pointed out, unfortunately, governments are schizophrenic so far.
I think Dora may want to make a point.
Yes, so the contradictions. So, I mean, I'm happy to hear that in terms of managing the economy, there are ways in which to reconcile the short-term and long-term contradictions that I talked about. But I would like to draw your attention to another contradictions, and that's between, the global policy responses that we were all hoping for and the nationalist reaction of many governments. So in Eastern Europe, we find, a lot of reactions that the pandemic is brought in by outsiders, by the foreigners, by the migrants. So unfortunately, a lot of policy responses are driven by, xenophobic and definitely anti-cooperative ideas of government. And so the pandemic is again creating this contradiction in that we do need a common response. But how governments perceive themselves and how they perceive their population interests is unfortunately often, fueling into the far right and making far right tendencies extraordinarily, important and visible. So that, so unfortunately there are even more contradictions I see.
I'd like to pick up that point and ask you all how you see your role in this situation, your role in communication. because there is so much conflicting information reaching us. And I'd like to ask how you can optimize your role as academics in this situation, and actually separately ask you how the crisis has affected the practice of your work. And I think it has made a change to some of you. But the main question is, how do you optimize your communication in this situation? I think, Luis, I'd like to start with you because I think it's something that directly concerns the initiative that you're involved in.
Yes, very much so. And, you know, I think I just want to pick up on one point that has been mentioned again and again, and that is the immediate against the long term. And just to say that what our initiative is trying to focus on is trying to identify a couple of major transformations that could actually drive these changes in the long term. For example, Diana already has mentioned the urban design, urban form. If one could make some transformations in that area, you're immediately addressing issues of mobility, of greenhouse gas emissions, of vehicle space for sustainability, for creativity, for livable spaces. So we're trying to identify things like this because we see that it is very difficult, and Matthias has already mentioned, the tendency is to try to save the automotive industry, whereas on the other hand, we're trying to save the urban spaces so that we don't have 60% of the space dedicated to parking spaces like that's the case in some cities in the United States. So I just wanted to make that point from the previous discussion. In terms of the communication, yes, one of the issues that we have picked up in all of our consultations is the issue of trust. And the issue of trust doesn't just come in terms of those trying to provide misinformation, but rather out of ignorance. And what is one of the major problems is that we still have very weak interface between the policy, science, and society. So that is a big theme that comes across not only in the science transformation systems, but also in all of them. So how do we do that? We need to have, and I think someone mentioned, in some cases in Central Europe, you have a lot of public participation at the population at large. In some others, you don't have any at all. Well, we don't have to tell you which one is the right way to do it, but I think that if we're trying to create the most systemic recommendations for trying to improve that, and that goes in trying to improve the communications from scientists to the policymakers and to the population at large. Many times the scientists have a way of communicating these ideas which is very obscure, and we need to change that so that it becomes more accessible to the population at large. And it's just, as I say, it's just how do we look from step one to step last in terms of the science, the policy, and the society interface. And we need to really feel that.
That seems such an important point. I'd just like to see if Dora or Matthias or Diana, yes, would like to add to that, because it does seem crucial in this discussion.
Yes, thank you. Just a very quick point, because I spoke enough, but this is so important here, that what this pandemic has really shown, and what's really shocked me, and where it's really brings a lot of questions, is the trust in science and the role of science in general that has been really shaken, I think, during this pandemic. At the beginning, it seemed that governments do listen to science and acted based on science. By today, as Dora also pointed out, it's much more the populist tendencies. And the problem is that that quite a significant share of the public opinion and the public view on the pandemic and related to the virus is shaped by fake news, by social media, conspiracy theories, and other fake theories rather than science. And the mere reduction in the role, how science has been able to shape the public view and public opinion as well as policy, I think shows that in Europe and probably globally, we are in a huge crisis about science communication and in general, the role of science in public discourse.
Thank you very much, Diana. And I know, Matthias, you have a point to make as well.
Yeah, no, I would like to respond to that because I think indeed the crisis of science is a very important one, and it's a major issue that we all have to think about. I think there is this. I think in the communicating scientific results, what I think is important also to take the citizens and their capacity to reflect very seriously, and maybe also even to open up a little bit about what science knows and what science doesn't know. That is to say, there are certain things that we do not know yet. And I think it's very important to also communicate that to the public, because it is also what determines a little bit the decision maker of policymakers. So there are also a few issues we don't know yet, and but it's not a trick, it's actually a rhetorical gesture that I think is very strong when you can come out and say, well, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, but even with all that we don't know, it is sufficient for us to act, like to make this argument, to acknowledge the unknowns, but at the same time to make the point that we still need to act, and then to engage in this hybrid discussion between laymen and scientists in a way that is not top-down, because maybe that is easier in East Asian countries, and it's not easy in Western democracies to have this top-down, this is what was decided, tam-tam. But then the question is, how do we find a modus vivendi where science and citizens interact to come to a conclusion that can be accepted and not be experienced as from the outside imposed? And I think that is a very important question also for social scientists, if I may. I mean, I also can make...
Sorry, say, Matthias, had you not finished?
Well, I still have another point to make, but if there's somebody else who wants to jump in, I'll make it later, if I get paid.
Well, I know that Lewis has a point, and I'd like to ask Dora in a moment as well. Lewis, over to you.
Yeah, very, very quickly, because it's an important point that is coming up again and again in our science consultations, and I failed to bring it up. And that is the case that we really need to have a major effort to build the research and scientific capacities in many countries around the world, where the institutions and their capacities are very weak. And that is something which we are identifying as one of the major priorities, because if we talk about the science policy and the interface with society becomes much more involved, we also need to bring that capacity at the local level in many, especially in the developing countries.
Thank you, Lewis. And Dora, I would like to ask you, and it connects, I think, with what both Lewis and Matthias have just said. Matthias said that the populations we're talking to shouldn't get the impression that the measures are being suggested are being opposed from outside. From your work in Central and Eastern Europe, especially what you call the dependent market economies, is that a risk that the people in these countries do feel that things are being imposed from outside on them?
Yes, I mean, so this is not, I mean, it's not something typical for Central and Eastern Europe, but so universities and the scientific knowledge, and especially scientific knowledge dissemination, has been in a crisis even before, you know, the pandemic. So the pandemic really just exaggerated or exposed more precisely. So I just want to draw everyone's attention that here at the Central European University, at the IR department, our PhD students run a project which they call Post-University, in which they precisely explore ways in which, you know, knowledge in the academia how it's changing and how it should change, and what are the interactions that Matthias also mentioned with, with the environment of our academic knowledge productions that could and should be involved. So I just can agree with everyone that was said so far in this regard.
Thank you very much. And Matthias, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the point that the science communication was a little bit in crisis before, and it's interesting to be here with Diana, because I think the IPCC itself acknowledged a bit the problem to convey the risks of climate change and try to learn from COVID, or maybe not, but I would like to, maybe Diana could tell me a little bit more about it. For the moment before that, I would just like to say that personally, I see my role, like I have, and I think with Dora, we have identified these national development banks as tools for change, which are really, something that governments can use to bring about this sustainable economy, or at least move towards it. And I think my role, with many others, is a little bit to shine a spotlight on their activities and to make sure that they do as much as they can, because as every organization, they will tend to stay in their comfort zone. So they might not do as much risk taking as they should for the sustainable transition. And so maybe as an academic, with the NGOs, with civil society, one can shine a spotlight there and say, hey, there's a potential for more. Yeah, that's you asked that question, Andrew, so I thought I answered it.
Sorry. Thank you, Matthias. Would you like to take that up, Diana?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think the IPCC has learned it the hard way that science communication doesn't work by itself. Scientists are typically very, very poor communicators, and we still struggle with that. I'm now in the scientific governance of the organization, and we are trying to write the next report, and we are trying to persuade the scientists to make much simpler figures, much more accessible product. But I think the IPCC has really reached a milestone in that, because our special report on 1.5 degrees climate change has been, by way, the most successful climate product ever in terms of media coverage. When we released it 2 years ago, it's soon exactly 2 years ago, then it has been picked up by every media all around the world, basically, in several major media. All entire days were devoted to it. Interestingly, what really shocked me, at least, that the messages that the media picked out were quite different from what we thought were the main messages. So it basically, the media picked up a doomsday scenario and exactly how the risks of climate change are so big. But actually, we were talking 1.5 degree climate change, where the risks of climate change are the least. And we tried to compare 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees climate change, which are still both manageable. So we definitely did not intend this at all as a report on the end of the world. So science communication is definitely interesting, but the bottom line was that, yes, you definitely need to train scientists constantly. You need to invest in this, and you do need to invest in translating the scientific findings into towards different audiences, because this is not trivial.
Oh, you just talked about bottom lines there. And I'd like to ask you all at this point, if there's a bottom line that you would like to transmit today from your point of view in your work, what would it be? And I would like to start with Dora, because of something that you had said to me about the Anthropocene and how you feel we should be understanding and seeing the whole crisis.
Yeah, so I mean, since we talked, David Attenborough also came to his YouTube channel and the Instagram that he's now using as communication, and made this very important point, is that it's really about the way in which production unfolds. So if it's not capitalism itself, it's definitely something about, you know, human activity that now we really know is changing the nature and our relation to nature. And there's maybe the bottom line would be here is there are various ways in which to go about it, and it has to be, you know, a global exercise to find, you know, common responses. It's not going to be easy due to the numerous contradictions that we just explored. Yeah, so that would be it. I can pass.
Thank you. And Matthias.
Yes, I mean, bottom lines. Yeah, I think I was very impressed when Luis spoke about urban redesign. And I think that is, for example, call to arms for all the urban designers. I'm sure they're already at it, thinking about it, looking at the bike lanes that are popping up and how these bike lanes, for example, could be reconciled with the, I think, also legitimate demands of car owners. So the important part is, and that is, I mean, I'm living in the country of the Gilets jaunes. The Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, they were all up in arms because they were asked to pay more for their gas. They were saying, hey, we're living we're poor, we're living in not the cities, so why are you punishing us? And so on. So which shows us that the transition that we're talking about needs to be brought about in a way that is the least socially disruptive, because it will be socially disruptive. But so there's the social dimension of this change that we're talking about that needs to be an element of that change itself in order to facilitate it. Like, if you don't take the people with you, you'll have so much friction in society between people who feel that they're suddenly losing out. That's where I think it's an important role also for social scientists to think about that. And that's the urban designers were important for that. That would be my bottom line.
Thank you. And Luis, same question, your bottom line.
Yeah, but my bottom line is accountability. I mean, I kept thinking, if I could define it only, if I can say only one word, I would say it's accountability. And this came up, to my surprise, actually from the head of the private sector in all of our consultations and our advisory board. And his point was, the private sector has probably one of the largest responsibilities of our transformation, of building back, of trying to avoid and improving. And what is happening today is that a lot of the communication from the science to this community is either non-existent or very difficult, very fractured, with a language which they claim is not really understandable. And his point was, we really need to make these messages a lot clearer, so that there is also so that this also creates more accountability on us, they say, of the business sector. And that accountability is going to come from the population at large, which is going to say, well, you're talking about building the environment, but you're building up your own industry rather than building the urban spaces so that we don't have to have more vehicles, this type of thing. So it's accountability through communication and involvement of the civil society, the society at large.
Thank you. That seems to be a huge part of it. The question of accountability, the question of communication, the question of trust. It was interesting to me that something that Diana said to me, she felt that there was a risk that we were sacrificing our health to personal freedom. I think that was a line that you used. And it seems, if from what Matthias just said, and actually from what all of you have been saying, that perhaps, if I'm interpreting this right, that people need to accept that it isn't really a loss so much of personal freedom, and that the benefits that are possible are bigger than any loss of freedom that could accrue. Is that a fair response to what you've been saying? To
Yes.
Diana.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew. Absolutely. So I think unfortunately, this is not my area of expertise, but from my area of expertise, I would definitely ask the political scientists, you know, where does freedom stop? My freedom to infect others, is that my freedom to cause a chain of pandemics, and at the end, a chain of infections, at the end of that chain, probably many fatalities. What kind of freedom is that? Whereas the Asian societies were able to curb this with certain, for example, Singapore or Taiwan, at fairly simple measures, which were perhaps not that acceptable in European and US democracies. But if you allow me, I also want to just come back to Matthias's point. Matthias, the bad news is, I think, that there is social disruption whatever we do. Unfortunately, if it's not how we change, then it's climate change and epidemics they bring, and the other impacts, they will bring much bigger social disruptions. The only question is whether we want to take these social disruptions in our hands and redesign them to be perhaps the least damaging, or we allow these waves of catastrophes to just pour the social disruptions on us. And so for me, the takeaway from all of this, the bottom line is that we are living through an enormous change, an enormous experiment on the globe. This requires a lot of research and much more research funding and research effort to be poured into, so that we can take best advantage of this. Just the fact that the European Commission had a call on the COVID-19 Horizon 2020 call, and for 11 million proposals for 11 million. The call was open for 20 days only. We also participated with I was very proud of the CEU consortium that we have. Unfortunately, we didn't win, because there were 178 proposals for a call that was open for only 20 days. That shows that the European research community is very eager to understand the impacts of both the crisis and the COVID itself, and what we can learn from it, and how we can size this opportunity, how we can use this for creating a new normal, a better world. But we need an enormous collaboration in the scientific community, and this discussion was absolutely great in forging these links. Thank you.
And thank you, Diana, and thanks to everybody for what is a fascinating discussion. And sadly, we are running out of time. I would just ask one last thing from any of you who feels that there's something that our viewers should be watching out for in the near future, new initiatives in particular. I think that just to repeat what I said at the beginning, that the Transformations Within Reach report of the Consultative Science Platform on COVID-19 is very soon coming out, and it does address directly some of the points that have been made today by all of the panel. So just a very quick comment, if any of you would like to look out for in the near future to help to inform ourselves better. So Matthias, please.
Yeah, I actually think for all the listeners, it's the events where scientists seek to meet and discuss with you citizens. And if you see those in your neighborhood, go there and enjoy. No, but like participate and discuss, because at least scientists have a lot to learn from citizens, as citizens have a lot to learn from scientists. And I mean, it's this discussion, this communication that we need in order to find the ways to, as Diana said, to structure it in the least socially disruptive way. But it will be socially disruptive, for sure. That's a very good point, I would like to say.
Would anyone else like to add a comment before we wind up?
Yes, please. I think this was an excellent point, and I think it's really important that we come down from our high horses, as we say in Hungarian. I don't know if it's stands in English. We need to co-create science. We need to co-generate the knowledge with the people, with the scientific, with the also lay people, with citizenry, but also with the policymakers and as well as with the professional community, because this one way of science that we generate knowledge and we just tell them what to do, this seems to be failing and this doesn't work. We have to come down and we have to sit down, and this is why what Martin's points was great. Let's talk together, let's co-generate the knowledge. We are not smarter than any other people out there. We can only do this together.
Thank you very much, Diana. Dora?
Yes, and in order to be able to do that, but we also need to ask from politicians to please uphold academic freedom, because this can only be done in such political settings where academic knowledge can be freely produced. And so the example of CEU, his recent history unfortunately shows that in certain settings it's just not happening at that, you know, that has an impact on both science and on science and society interactions at large.
Thank you. I think we'd all agree that's an absolutely vital point. Thanks. Luis, anything that you would like to draw people's attention to before we finish?
Thank you, Andrew. No, I think that you already covered what I was going to say about our report. Just to also say that this report will sort of be the building block for what we hope to be the second phase, when we're going to go into more analytical work, scenario work, pathways, and I hope that everyone in this room will be able to be accompanying us in this new phase. And then to thank you very much. Thank you. It was a fascinating and also very diverse perspective. So I'm delighted, and a very good moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. I'd like to thank you all so much for sharing your expertise and insights. Thanks also to the Central European University for hosting this roundtable discussion in their Borderless Knowledge series, and particularly with such a stimulating interdisciplinary approach. There's more about the work of the Central European University on their website, ceu.edu. And it just remains for me to say thank you all for watching. Thank you to Diana Ugo-Forschatz, to Dora Piroshka, to Luis Gomez Echeverri, and to Matthias Thiemann, and goodbye to you all. Thank you.